Ah, et n'oublie pas d'enregistrer, Amaury.
Bonjour. Bonjour à tous les participants. Je laisse quelques secondes.
Hello to all of our participants. I'm just giving a few more seconds to make sure everyone is connected.
Bonjour.
Bonjour, bonjour. Je crois qu'on n'est pas au complet puisqu'on a plus de 400 inscrits pour ce
We have about 400 participants for our third
organisé par
workshop of this new series organized by Climate Change regarding climate data in Africa. I think we can start. There are many of us on this call. Hello, everyone. I'm Vanessa Lobin. I'm a member of Climate Change Association. I'm also a consultant for adaptation strategies regarding climate,
notamment sur le continent africain. Et je suis très heureuse
mainly on the African continent, and I'm very glad to be your host for this workshop. For your information, this workshop is being recorded, and there is also live interpretation to English and French. You just have to click on the globe, which you can find at the bottom of your screen to access the interpretation. Please mute your mics. Thank you. Thank you for muting your microphone.
Gérer les micros, si possible. Voilà, merci.
Okay, thank you.
Donc, sachant que nous sommes très nombreux, donc il va falloir
There are many of us on this call, so we have to make sure all our mics are muted. In a few words, I'm going to introduce this workshop. And if you do have questions, I would ask you to write your question in the chat box. And we will make sure to take your questions into consideration. But please do not unmute your mic. Thank you. We have 400 people registered for this workshop. There's about 90 of us. However, it shows the interest connected to this topic of emission factors for our third workshop, which is part of a new cycle which had been decided during the Accra Summit in 2019. During that summit, we had discussed the availability of climate data in Africa. We had addressed the issue around this topic of access to climate data, and we had decided to continue in 2020 and then in 2021 a series of workshops to think and find some solutions to improve access to climate data, especially for non-state actors in Africa. The purpose of this summit or of these workshops was to identify the various African initiatives in order to improve access to climate data for non-state actors in Africa and to explore the various possibilities of collaboration between the various stakeholders in Africa, and also to share good practices, share best practices between the various actors. We've already had 2 of these workshops. The first workshop regarding adaptation to climate change, and the second one was regarding activities data, to look at activities data. And this third workshop today regarding emission factors. I will quickly explain the difference between activity data and emission factors. This is just a quick reminder, and then we will let our speakers explain this more in detail. Now, you do not measure, but you calculate an emission factor by calculating an activity data, for example, the number of kilometers of a car, a 5C CV car, multiplied by an emission factor, which is an average for CO2 emission per kilometer. So this emission factor exists by default, especially those that have been given by the IPCC, but they can also be improved to make sure they match the realities, local realities of gas emissions. In order to address this issue today, I'm delighted to welcome our 5 speakers for today. Mathieu Weimar, who is a lawyer and expert in environmental and climate law, also an associate researcher at the IDRI. He will explain to us this context and what is at stake with the emission factor and why it's important to talk about it and why we need to find new ways and avenues to improve the emission factors for the African stakeholders. Juariatou Wage will be with us. She's a project manager at the Association Bilan Carbon Assessment. She will talk to us about the various ways to work on a carbon database in Africa. And then we have Abdelrani Boucham, the head of climate change department at the Moroccan Ministry of Energy, Mines and Environment. He will also explain or share with us the example of Morocco. Leo Gena, who is the associate director in charge of the public sector for iCare and Consult, and Mamadou Batiem, who is the national focal point for RED Plus in Burkina Faso. And he will be sharing about the experience of Burkina Faso in the forestry sector. We will have a two levels moderation with Mathieu as well, Mathieu Weimar. And I would invite you again to use the live translation that is available if you need it, and to ask any questions via the chat box. We will collect your questions, and we will try as much as possible to have enough time before the end of this meeting at 4:30 to answer your questions. Before we start, I would invite you to a quick survey, which you can see on the screen right now. This quick survey gives you the opportunity to take part and answer this survey on this website, www.menti.com, with the following code, 5422808. It's a survey to try to help assess the difficulty around this topic. Now, what kind of difficulties have you experienced during emission factors? And we would ask you to answer this question. What difficulties have you experienced using emissions factors? And you have 4 possible choices here around the issue of emission factors, and we will give you the results just before Mathieu takes the floor. I'm gonna hand over now. I give the floor, yield the floor to Mathieu.
T'as des lieux, des enjeux.
For an overview and
juste pour que tout le monde puisse reprendre bien. Ah, voilà. Mathieu, bonjour.
Mathieu, it's over to you. Hello, everyone. Now, in a few minutes, could you give us an overview of what is at stake and the challenges regarding the building of emissions factors that are adapted to the specific African context. Yes, I will surely try to do this. I'm not actually an expert in this field. This is a very technical topic. We're talking about a coefficient. We're talking about a way to quantify the emissions, absorptions, and the activity data. It's a combination of quantity and to get an overview of a way of calculating. We may wonder what is a lawyer has to do with this. It's a good question. It's a very technical topic. However, I think it's very useful to place this technical topic in this context of climate change, especially the issue of transparency from the Paris Agreement. You know that this transparency framework requires a transparency, and the first has to be done.
Notamment un rapport national d'inventaire qui doit être établi conformément aux lignes directrices du GIEC de 2006.
Okay. There is a report regarding progress that have been made during the implementation phase. This is something that is very new for many developing countries regarding the mitigation, to have to submit to a transparency framework, which is why Article 13 of the Paris Agreement requires or has allowed for some flexibility. Since COP22, their capacity has been strengthened to focus mainly on reinforcing capacity for transparency building. What I would like to underline mainly is that the implementation of the Paris Agreement relies on a transparency in support and in action. This is a mean that has been selected to help countries maintain their commitments, and also another way to reinforce international cooperation. Quite clearly, if transparency is a basic fundamentals of the Paris Agreement, the transparency relations have to be strong. Of course, this depends on the data, and that will give way to a level of credibility and to reinforce trust between countries, which is a main issue. Of course, if you look deeper into the technical aspect, you also realize that there is a political dimension. If you look at the IPCC, which the African countries have to apply, it relies on prioritization to try to identify categories of emission factors that would have an influence in terms of emission factors. And the rules and regulations shows this flexibility. First of all, they can try to identify the key emission factors up to 85% instead of the 95% required for developed countries. This is in order to rely on the most emission factors and to use the capacities in order to draw this list or the inventory for these types of activities. This is what has been required. Once you have identified your categories of key emission factors, then you need to apply various methods of two or three levels out of 3 levels. This means superior methodology to be more exact, to be more precise, and to support the efforts to try to reach the targets. Usually, what happens is that countries, when they try to evaluate the superior level, they will try to resort to some kind of literature or data from on a national or international basis, and they might even turn to database from the IPCC, and then they can compare their own elements, their own factors to these other database, which happens quite often in Africa. Many countries are not in a position to adapt or to adopt superior levels for several key factors, either because they do not have the access to the data or they do not have the factors. Therefore, they have to resort to the basic approach, which is level 1, and they have to justify this. But what matters the most is that a country should be able to resort to something that is a national overview while following the rules and regulations of the IPCC. However, if we use the level 1 methodology, this can actually raise a number of questions. And also from a political point of view, one may wonder about the exact figures of the emission factors. This might not be so bad for energy, but I believe that emission factors depend on carbon, and it's something that you can rely on. However, for industrial process, it seems that level 1 does not take into account the level of this process. Therefore, the emission factor by default might not always reflect the mitigation efforts of a country, even though a country has to report about their mitigation efforts to reach the target. Another sector, which we're going to discuss this afternoon, which is the effort sector in the forestry field, for example. It's important, however, to fully integrate all the agricultural or forestry practices to make sure that the emission factor would match the actual emissions. There is a big challenge for African countries. For many of these countries have made strong commitments. This is a discussion which we're going to have this afternoon. How do African countries tackle this approach? Do they have sufficient resources, capacities to establish their own emission factors? Are they facing other obstacles in terms of governance? What lessons can we draw from this, especially in the effort sector? And we will be talking mainly about the Burkina Faso experience. And we will be talking about this in a technical approach and in a serious approach during this workshop. Thank you for your attention. Now I'm giving the floor to Mrs. Wagé, I believe.
Madame Wagé, je vous en prie.
Madame Wagé, it's over to you.
Du coup, Amaury, je vais partager mon écran parce qu'il y a une petite modification sur une slide, vous me rappelez.
Alors peut-être Madame Wagé, peut-être pouvez-vous vous présenter. Vous êtes donc chef
Could
de...
you introduce yourself, first of all? You are project officer at the association Bilan Carbon Assessment. Thank you for giving me the floor. Mrs. Wagé, project officer at the Bilan Carbon Association. And we carry this methodology in France for the last 10 years now at Bilan Carbon Assessment Association. And I'm going to present to you the way we develop and build a carbon base and why should we have a carbon database.
Est-ce que vous voyez quelque chose?
Entre-temps, je me permets simplement de
Just a
rappeler
quick reminder
son micro.
to everyone to mute your microphones, please, and to
La barre de chat.
write your questions in the chat box if possible,
Le site www.menti.com.
and to answer our survey on the Menti website for the small survey which we are running throughout this workshop.
Merci. Est-ce que vous voyez mon écran? Oui, très bien. Très bien. Alors, du coup, comment et pourquoi créer votre base carbone? Donc,
Why should we develop and create a carbon database? Just quickly, a short presentation of our association that was started in 2011 to use the carbon database method after a beginning of our activities in the early 2004, and following the rules and regulations of gas emissions in France. We were given this tool in 2011 to develop this method. We have expanded also our missions by developing other tools as part of the energy and climate transition with the management system for gas emission, which is a monitoring phase. And since 2016, we have also developed another tool via a partnership with the ADEME and the CDP with the ACT, Assistant Climate Transition Carbon, in order to assess the strategy of transition, carbon transition. We have also taken part in various live projects at a European level to support other members of the EU to help them develop carbon accounting policies. And finally, since 2016, we have also developed other missions by developing expertise with our members and doing awareness campaigns, webinars, and reaching out to citizens and other stakeholders beyond the association. This is just a quick presentation of our association. Now moving on to our objectives and goals. Since last year, we have been working on a note, an explanation note, to question the issues of why should we build a carbon database. If we look at the global scale, and if we look at the emission factors or elements to draw emission factors, we have 8 bases which are accessible with various criteria, either free or not free. And among these bases, we have the carbon database, which was developed with the tool at the beginning of the year 2000 in France. This need for carbon accounting has been emerging everywhere at different scale, whether it be for companies, associations, states, and a need for national inventories as part of the international agreements or the Paris Agreement. The first thing to do a carbon database is to have the right tool. And if we look at it closer, what will be at the heart of the carbon database will be the emission factors, either in connection with a specific tool or not. However, we do need to be able to access the emission factors, which are particular climate database that have to be combined with activity data. It's quite specific to be able to convert activity data into emission factors. For any stakeholder interested in accounting, carbon accounting, they need to look for the right tool or method And if we look at this closer still, one may ask, what would be the relevancy of the emission factors? Where do they come from? And are they really relevant? Do they reveal the reality on the field or in the geographical zone that we are working on? Therefore, the goal is to be able to have access to a regional or national database. We've talked about energy, but it can also relate to waste management or to transportation. And other factor emissions could be generic and can be used at various levels. However, the emission factors remain at the heart of the carbon print and carbon database in order to reduce gas emission, because that would lead to a development and technical research to seek to reduce gas emissions through various technological developments. So why should we develop a carbon database? First of all, to be able to provide all the users who need the emission factors, whether they'd be standard emission factors or adapted emission factors. But the point is to have a basis, a database, a bottom base of carbon database. The various emission factors, standard emission factors, which we call non-representative, provide from international data, but do not always reflect the reality of territories. All the tools that will be built around emission factors will also be able to influence the kind of tools which we will be using and propose to the various stakeholders who need these tools. Now, the adapted emission factors will be more specific to a local context, and they would reflect more precisely what is happening on the ground. And throughout the years, we can follow the evolution of the emission factors, whether or not this has increased or not, to look at the efficiency and various criteria connected to emission factors that would lead also to a reduction of the emission factors overall. Once we have the emission factors, we can therefore have our carbon accounting and come up with a carbon assessment and monitor the progression, whether at a territorial or regional level. This will also raise awareness to draw attention on this topic. This can be done also at a citizen level or in schools. So by starting from a need, we can also lead this to an awareness factor and to an educational dimension. How do we build a carbon database, which is our question for today? The first thing, of course, is to realize that we need some data. Where do these data come from? You need to be able to access life cycle, technical data, etc. But not only, also to be able to access resources, whether they be human resources, human skills, technical skills, financial resources. It takes time to develop a database. It requires a lot of finances to have the appropriate support and to make it accessible to the various partners, whether it be a specific software. This would require finances, of course, to develop the technology. And thirdly, a whole range of actors, stakeholders on a voluntary basis. First of all, you have a basic structure requiring the need for this database, Yet this might not be sufficient. So this first structure has to surround itself with various actors, with a user's representation or a institutional representation, a whole range of stakeholders that will make up the governance of this basis, of this database, which will form a governance committee that will be in charge of the functioning and the development of the carbon database. And that would justify the reason for this carbon database. You have a scheme here that shows the various challenges from the foundation of the basis. You can see the emergence also of a whole range of activities. If you create a carbon database, it's not just giving a list of emission factors, but it's also a need to draw attention to also have discussion with the users to try to raise the various competencies and skills, and also to be able to develop other tools using standards or international norms from the IPCC protocol, but also other tools which are more relevant to the specific activities in a local area. And that would lead us to the core of this database, which is to reduce the gas emissions. Just to give you an example, we have the carbon database of the DEM, which is about 20 years old now. It's a free database. We have about over 3,000 users per month, and this is being updated on a regular basis, twice a year. And this actually helps various stakeholders to work on reducing gas emissions. We encourage people, private actors or public actors, to come up with other suggestions as long as it matches the philosophy that
Pourrait-on mettre le graphique en pleine page pour
we
certains?
have developed.
On voit pas très bien.
Alors, je ne sais pas comment je peux faire plus que ça.
Cet effet loupe sur la petite loupe.
Alors, il y a
Non,
un
c'est
autre
pas très
schéma
grave.
qui arrive.
D'accord, on continue comme ça,
Ouais.
ça.
Finalement, le cœur de cette base carbone va tenir
So the
vraiment
heart of this carbon base relies on the various stakeholders working together around this project. One key point is to list all the various methodologies or existing projects already existing, to include those stakeholders in the development of their carbon base, and also to gather the various skills and competencies to make up the governance committee, along with additional actors that would contribute to the facilitation, the development, etc. And the users of the carbon base will be represented in this governance committee, which will be very transparent and very relevant as a representative of the various stakeholders. The issue is to have a representation of all the stakeholders. We plan the training in the long term, and therefore we gather all the various technical expertise, the necessary financing and funds in the early years of the development of the project, but we need to continue to update all these elements in terms of portage as well. It's important to be legitimate, to have good competences in the administrative field sector for future development. On top of this cartography mapping, once you have identified all of these various actors, you need to also prioritize their skills. They may have different skills from one place to another. So the purpose here is to be able to identify local stakeholders and support them with the help of international stakeholders, and to be able to gather and collect all the necessary skills to maintain the strength of the governance committee. So this is a slide which shows you the various roles and competencies and activities that are needed. As a conclusion, building a carbon base is a long-term project that will be necessary towards a low carbon development. The emergence also of transition plans and action plans. So at the end of the day, all these activities would also help to raise awareness for a number of stakeholders that might not have been targeted by this carbon database. It's a collaborative project, including a lot of structures from the energy sector, transport sector, agricultural, etc., all kinds of activities that could be represented. So the basis, of course, will be looking into all the priority gas emission factors and build up from there on. For the development of our carbon base is an opportunity not only to develop a carbon accounting, but also to develop, in terms of development, anything that has to do with companies and other actors, other stakeholders. Thank you very much for this presentation, Mrs. Wage. It's very thorough presentation.
Je vais me permettre, si c'est possible,
If possible, I would like to quickly give the floor to Mr. Mayer, who suggested we make a clarification that was in the chat box between the emission factors for the carbon accounting. So we do have Mr. Mayer with us today. He's part of the French delegation. Is a specialist in this field. Mr. Mayer, could we give you the floor if you are still there? Yes, I am. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? I'm part of the negotiation team. I do have this skill and this experience. Just to remind our auditors that the emission factors are relating to an activity, so it's the matching of these two elements that is important, whether it be gas or coal or kilometers per lorry transportation or personal vehicle, etc. The emission factor is always connected to the activity. For the UNFCCC inventory, the emission factors has to have special emissions. So what we're doing here is really what is coming out physically from the country. We're taking into consideration the facilities of a particular countries. Now, for the carbon assessment, the goal is mainly to be as close as possible to the carbon print. Therefore, we're dealing here with the scope 1 or 2, 3, indirect emissions and other types of emissions, subcontractors, customers, etc. Therefore, it's important to realize the different approach, which is the inventory approach on the one hand, and the approach in line with the carbon responsibility. That's what I wanted to underline. It's slightly different. There's a slight difference between the two. Local governments often are swinging between the two. Both it's a territory and it's also activities in connection to services. It's interesting to look at the way we handle this complexity. We need to keep in mind that there are specificities both for the inventory, which might be different from a carbon assessment from a company, for example. Thank you for this explanation, which was useful. Now I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Abdelrani Boucham from the Ministry of Energy and Mine and Environment in the Moroccan government. Mr. Boucham, are you still with us? Yes. Hello. Could you share with us about your Moroccan experience regarding emission factors and what is at stake, and mainly about the way that Morocco is developing its own carbon base? Regarding the ministry which I represent for the environment, we are dealing mainly with the national inventory. We have developed a national system of inventory and gas emission, and we do have a decree since 2019. And things are very structured, and every department, every ministry has to bring up their own data for biannual report or for national communication or national contribution. As has just been said by the previous speaker, there is a big gap between the carbon assessment method and the inventory method. As a coordinator, I'm a national coordinator of the National System for Gas Emission, greenhouse gas emission. We use the IPCC method of 2016, or 2006 rather, and we have been able now to develop and improve our national inventory by 20%. When we were using the 1996 inventory, but when we use the new methodology, we gain 20%. This is regarding the inventory. Now, the topic for today is to talk about our experience regarding emission factors on carbon base. During a PMR program from the World Bank, we were able to assess 3 sectors of phosphates, cement and electricity sectors. The carbon assessment was introduced in Morocco and we have developed relationships with Moroccan companies to be able to develop or to assess rather the carbon print. This is a foundation which gives access to a free calculator to assess the carbon print. We use this, for example, this PMR project. Will share my screen. I hope you'll be able to see this.
Non, il faut cliquer sur écran partagé, le bouton vert en bas de votre écran.
Je l'ai fait.
Et après, il faut sélectionner votre page.
Ok, je vais le faire encore une fois. Alors, je descends. Partager, c'est ça?
Écran partagé, cliquez directement sur le bouton et pas sur la petite flèche. Si c'est un site internet, je peux le faire pour vous, si vous mettez le lien.
Je suis en train de voir là où est-ce qu'il y a la présentation. Okay.
Sinon, continuez, vous pouvez me l'envoyer par mail et je vais le faire pour vous si vous voulez. C'est pas très.
Oui, alors pour l'envoyer, j'en vais être un peu déconnecté, donc je ne vais pas continuer à parler.
D'accord.
Mais c'est bon, donc je disais donc, on a devant cette expérience-là. Ou si vous me donnez une minute pour que je l'envoie?
Ouais, allez-y.
Ok,
Ouais,
bah,
ouais.
voilà. Alors là, je suis désolé pour ce contretemps. Moi, je croyais que ça va y aller tout de suite. Alors là. Oh, oui, alors,
Alors, pendant qu'on attend
Ouais.
désolé.
le PowerPoint, je vous en prie, si vous ne l'avez pas encore fait, je vous invite
While we're waiting for the presentation, I would invite all our participants to
utiliser le code 54
go to
22
our www.menti.com website and use the code 5422808 to answer our survey.
à la fin de l'atelier.
Oui, je n'ai pas reçu votre document. Sinon, bah, peut-être continuez simplement dès que je le reçois, je le mettrai.
Bah, je suis en train de faire de mon mieux. Ok, bon, alors là, normalement, ça ne va pas tarder. Alors, oui, je suis désolé pour ce contretemps. Alors, je vais... Alors là. J'ai envoyé donc, j'espère que vous l'aurez.
Allez-y, peut-être continuer pendant que Amaury va le.
Oui,
va
alors là, je
l'afficher
disais
par la
donc
suite.
c'est l'expérience qu'on a eue dans le cadre du projet
Our own
PME.
experience as part of the PMA project. This was financed by the World Bank. Morocco chose to work in 3 sectors: cement, phosphate, and electricity. And the purpose was to assess the various mitigation measures in these 3 sectors to involve the private sector as part of the national efforts for mitigation, and also to upgrade the efforts in the public sector.
Donc, moi, j'avais un plan, c'est de vous parler donc, de cette expérience qu'on a eue.
So I'm going to share about our experience.
Le PMR donc, fait partie d'une réflexion.
PMR was part of a government reflection to include the carbon market, as I just explained. We were not starting from scratch. Morocco managed to include several projects and also elaborated several sectors, which we call the NAMAs, N-A-M-A, and was supported by the Green Fund, global funds, as part of the World Bank program. So there was a framework. This is a program running from 2020 to 2030, and the purpose is to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gas by 17%. With a contribution from the given sectors. If we talk about the sector of energy, with an effort of 47% of emission reduction, for cement 6% and 3% for phosphates. Mitigation efforts is mainly in the electricity and self-produced electricity, and also improving the efficiency of the various process of the industrial sectors. We came up with various scenarios based on the criteria of efficiency, acceptability, and an easiness of implementation. 3 scenarios that were respecting the environmental aspect and with a system of quota exchange, as is the case on the European level. The second scenario, to maximize the reduction, and then the third scenario, which is an optimized effort to minimize carbon taxes. The challenge, therefore, to be able to implement this program for mitigation efforts, people had to be motivated to be able to. And the Moroccan government showed that there was a funding possible for any actions in the industrial and in energy sectors, 17.9 billion and 15.1 million. The mobilization of international funds available was made possible by the centralization of the expertise in terms of finance engineering. The mitigation potential corresponds to a reduction of emissions in a given sector. We looked at 3 different scenarios from a lower level from 2020 to an average level, $20 per ton from 2020, and a third level, a high level of $30 per ton as of 2025. Now for electricity, since 2000, the consumption of electricity at a national level has been progressing by 6.5% on a yearly basis. And the electricity in the rural areas now reaches about 99.4% in 2016. The ONEE, which is a national office for electricity and water, which is in charge of 60% of the network. Sorry to interrupt you. We only have about 30 minutes left. Just a quick question so we can try to focus on the main topic, the potential of gas emission mitigation. Was this estimated on proper data relevant to Morocco, or was this a combination of various factors, emission factors? For electricity, we do have a national office. We are able to control this on a national level. And we have noticed an improvement of about 40% for electricity production. We have another national factor for transport and the cargo transport, which is something we just had last year in 2020. And this factor, emission factor, was given through the transportation ministry. So these two factors, emission factors, are nationals. But we need to not stop at the emission factor, which we use by default, of course, but this emission factor is multiplied by the activity data, which contains many parameters. And sometimes the country does not have all of these parameters. So Morocco really made the effort and did a lot of field surveys to try to determine the various parameters included into the activity data. Even though there is an emission factor, when you make the calculation, if you look for national data and compared it by the IPCC factors, but if we manage to make it more relevant to a national effort, then it's a positive gain. Yes, we had another workshop in October regarding access to data, activity data, and the need to consolidate activity data in order to come up with reliable inventories, which is why I'm insisting on the emission factors, which requires a lot of efforts for each of the country concerned to work on their relevant emission factors. It's always a project as such to do this assessment. What, according to you, would be the main obstacles, hindrances, for example, in Morocco or African countries? What would be the hindrances when it comes to this work of establishing the emission factors to each country? Is it mainly an issue of competence or financial means? I would say actually both. From our own experience, especially in this last example of in the transport field, there was a call to tender, and there were no nationals. So we targeted research centers, universities, yet we did not get any response. So we had to turn to those that did have the expertise to be able to measure various elements. It requires, yes, means, financial means, through the help of cooperation, and we did this as part of the UNFCCC program. Are there any regional initiatives of cooperation? There could be similarities with neighbor countries, for example. Do you know of any regional initiatives? The picture which I sent you was taken in Senegal as part of a French-speaking program, which was a 3-day program, and we did share about our Moroccan experience there in Senegal. We shared about the inventories, our biannual reports, etc. We also run some webinars, and we did this with several other African countries, about 20 African countries, and we were able to share our experiences. However, I think we need to really draw from this collaboration even more so, since we have a lot to learn from one another. Thank you very much. We will now hand the floor to our next speaker, and I'm sure we will come back for more questions. Now we will turn to Léo Gélin, who is in charge of eye care and consult. Léo, are you there?
Tout à fait.
Alors déjà peut-être très rapidement.
First of all, maybe one comment or one reaction to what has been shared so far.
technique
And
sur
maybe we'll go more into details about the technical aspect of building
vous en a parlé un petit peu.
carbon database.
Très concrètement,
Mr.
ce
Bushman
travail
gave us a few hints.
de recherche et des mesures sur le terrain. Donc, comment on procède?
How do you proceed? How do you go about working on an emission factor? For a study office like yours, I can consult.
Tout à fait, oui.
Alors, je vais passer très rapidement pour dire deux mots sur.
Now,
sur
quickly, I will present our office in advice and consultation for climate, for environment. We also work around the issue of circular economy, biodiversity, and societal challenges in relation to environmental transition. You find various objectives and missions you can see here, and objectives and results, and I will run this quickly. We worked for support initiatives in Tunisia, for example, as part of a European project in Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria. We supported various local governments. We also worked with the C40 program with different cities at a European level, also in China, in India, or in Brazil, as part of a program of the C40 program on the elaboration of gas emission inventory for various cities. We also work with other places in France, and as part of a cooperation project between the ADEME and the NME in Tunisia and another organization in Morocco about developing emission factors to the particular context of these two countries of Morocco and Tunisia, with an objective to realize a future project at the company level, but also at a territory level, which echo some of the questions that were raised earlier on. A quick reminder regarding emission factors. We have at a world level the primary levels of data given by the IPCC regarding the fuel combustion. If you burn 1 liter of diesel fuel or somewhere else, I would make it simple, but globally, the combustion level are pretty much the same globally. Now, if we come to the scale of a territory or a company, what we will need will be an emission factor in connection to the electricity consumption. For example, 10 kilowatts of electricity consumed, or at a building level, if we take it at a company's level. Therefore, the data would be either available via the International Energy Association or on a base-to-base, on a case-to-case basis. Some countries work already on the publication and the updating of emission factors at a country level.
Qui concerne ces fameux facteurs d'émission plus spécifiques qui vont permettre de traiter des données d'activité qui ne sont pas des litres de carburant et autres, qui peuvent être des nombres de mètres carrés chauffés ou climatisés, qui peuvent être des nombres de kilomètres parcourus. Et dans ce cas,
in order to have access to these emission factors, you need to either look for available data, either from the NGOs or ministries, or to develop them yourselves. Just for your information, there is an uncertainty around these various factors. On primary factors around the electricity consumption, it's quite feeble, around 5 to 10%. On specific data, it's more uncertain, which is not a problem as such, but you need to be aware of that the carbon accounting at a territory level or at a company level is probably more uncertain than what is given at a national level, which is more specific. A small example on the case of Morocco. These are data from the National Agency for Energy in CO2 per kilowatt. In a particular country, we're talking about 800, around 800 in the year 2000, and down to about 700 in 2016. You can measure and observe the various efforts that have been made in terms of emission reduction in this particular country. And also the point of having access to this data, which is helpful. It's also very helpful to have access to this data when you want to develop specific emission factors around electricity, for example, the use of tram or light train. You would need the emission factors on electricity to do this. It's a necessary step to be able to have access to these emission factors. Now, building the actual emission factors as such, I will now show you the very things which we have done in Morocco and Tunisia. Here in the sector of transportation, to clarify the perimeter of what it entails and what it covers. These emission factors were developed at a level of a territory or a company in order to identify the various levers and responsibilities, not just to the combustion aspect. What are the interests? What is the purpose of having these emission factors? I've tried to explain the 4 points which are important in order to reach more specific emission factors. First of all, to describe the sector, in particular when it comes to road transport. Secondly, to integrate the carbon weight in connection with the manufacturing of the vehicles. Thirdly, to integrate the carbon weights upstream in connection to extraction or transportation of the fuel, especially in the area of transportation, to be able to compare a diesel vehicle with another type of vehicle. What happens in the vehicle is very important between two vehicles. And fourthly, and lastly, to adjust the consumption of fuel per type of vehicles adapted to the country. And this is going beyond the IPCC standard or norm. You see a small representation of potential enrichment. The upstream part, this upstream part can be, for example, where does my natural gas come from? How is it being transformed? How is it being transported? How is my electricity being developed? In the future, there will be electrical vehicles in many countries. Secondly, what is the carbon weight? And thirdly, the adjustment of the consumptions depending on the type of vehicles. Just a few examples to show you what it can entail, in particular here for Morocco. We have integrated the carbon weight depending on the type of vehicles. We have worked on the consumption of fuel consumption adapted to the context of a country, and we use the data given by the ministry. This is something which we did in 2012, 2013. So, and just to try to assess the fleet in a given country, this is what we had back then. What would be the average distance per vehicle, also given by the Ministry of Transportation, and another reflection on the use of the vehicles, whether or not these vehicles would be used in an urban zone, urban area, or mixed area, rural and urban, in order to calculate the various use of a vehicle. Again, the figure on the right-hand side is a level of uncertainty, which is what I mentioned earlier on. On these kind of emission factors, there is a high level of uncertainty. Another example is regarding buses and coaches, and also large taxis and light trains. Again, we have the element of the carbon weight. On this particular case of Morocco, we also have something that we call large taxi. We look at this kind of transportation means, which is still very important in this country, especially for going from one city to another. We detailed the kind of vehicles, the kind of taxis, what were the average consumption level, etc., in order to come to these final elements and results mixed with the level of emission. I also mentioned the light train, tramway light train. And the other data, we worked also on the occupational rate on average per vehicle, and we looked at the emission factors with various units. If we work from a territory basis or from a company basis, that is the kind of people and a number of people using different means of transport. A second example, and that will be my last example, regarding cargo transportation, goods transport. We wanted to look at the terminology of the Ministry of Transport to characterize the various types of vehicles for the transportation of goods. Different companies would have different types of vehicles with the various data for consumption per kilometer. With the average ton of each vehicle. And as was the case for transportation, we look at the two units, either per kilometers or per ton. And the last step is the global integration of all the elements of the carbon emission before and during the combustion, depending on the activity level. Some recommendations, some feedback regarding the development of emission factors. I think it is a project in itself. It's something that we have done with various organizations. It requires a lot of means, a lot of time. It also requires a strong institutional portage to be able to have access to the data. I mentioned the Ministry of Transport, but there are other stakeholders. We also work with other representatives of the government. This could also serve as an opportunity to bring alongside other companies and to develop a local ecosystem. We reached to about 50 different companies in Morocco, and we wanted them to be part of this development. These were companies from various fields, and transport, maritime, all the various ministries, well, companies in the maritime, road transport, other companies producing raw materials like plastic, copper, etc., various services as well in waste management, to get a feedback and an inventory that can really help to develop further emission factors when it comes to services, goods purchases, etc. This is what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Again, we want to highlight the difference between the emission factors in connection to national levels or to the carbon accounting and the carbon print of products or activities. I think, Leo, you were talking about carbon accounting mainly. We went from one to another throughout this workshop, but we did understand that there are two different aspects. Now, let's talk again about emission factors in activity, emission factors in connection to carbon print for specific sectors, especially in Africa. And one question that is being raised quite often is regarding the waste management, the issue of waste management. There is a lack of activity data regarding the waste management. This is a structural issue in most of the African countries because of the weak point in waste collection. Do you know, and I'm asking all our speakers here, do you have any examples of any works that have been carried out around the issue of waste management, specifically in Africa? Even among our participants, if somebody would like to share an initiative, an example of waste management, or any of our speakers. Just to give you an example, there is a company called Africa Global Recycling, AGR, in Togo, that took part in a carbon assessment activity, and we worked with them. They did not have any specific emission factors on waste, but they were already assessing their own carbon accounting in the recycling sector. And they started to have the beginning of an emission factor, even though it was more global and not specific to a particular activity. However, this is just one example.
D'accord, merci beaucoup. Alors, on va bien sûr partager les supports de présentation à la fin de
You will be sent the various support and the various presentations. We also have a last speaker from Burkina Faso. Mr. Kwate, you are replacing the speaker for today. Thank you for joining us at the last minute.
Interroger sur l'expérience du Burkina Faso.
I wanted to ask you about your own experience in Burkina Faso. regarding the development of
pratique
factors,
du Burkina,
more
notamment sur le
specifically for Burkina Faso in the area of forestry. Would you have a particular experience to share with us from Burkina Faso?
Merci. Effectivement, il faut déjà dire
Yes,
que
indeed.
le secteur AFAT, comme on le
The
dit,
AFAT sector, as we call it, the agricultural and forestry sector, is very important in Burkina
25%
Faso, representing about 85% of gas emissions,
nationale. Donc,
according to the national data. Therefore, it is a point of focus. On the other hand, Burkina Faso is a vulnerable country as part of the Sahel and has given way to many initiatives.
assez tôt par rapport à l'engouement qui existe aujourd'hui au niveau
And this was
international
done early enough. Or
climatique. Donc, au Burkina
in view
Faso,
of
il
the climate change awareness, in Burkina
national et
Faso, we have two levels, the national level
des projets et initiatives. Au niveau
and
national,
the
le pays
initiatives.
est aujourd'hui en
At a
train de
national
finaliser
level,
la communication
the
nationale.
country is finalizing its third national communication. So far, we were following the guidelines of the IPCC to draw these national communications and using the emission factors by default at a national level. In 2015, we started the RED Plus initiative that developed a level of reference, especially in the forestry field, by using and developing more specific emission factors, more specific to the country. As I was saying, these two levels of accounting or computation do not always allow us to monitor the activities on the field.
Ça peut être des projets concernant les foyers à améliorer ou des activités
And this concerns various other activities like reforesting, for example.
Et que la RED Plus a vraiment permis au pays
The
de
RED
faire
Plus initiative has helped Burkina Faso to make great efforts and improve its effectiveness in terms of emission reduction. We've also identified carbon reservoir
le carbone organique du sol également. Et puis,
and organic carbon in the soil.
comme je le disais tout à l'heure, il existait déjà en quelque sorte des acquis.
We already had some experience in the past, especially regarding air biomass,
forestiers qui ont été
on the basis of the forestry inventories that were carried out on a national level, more specifically the second forest inventory.
avaient effectivement pour mandat de produire en quelque sorte les volumes de bois ligneux disponibles dans le pays. Donc,
in order to list the various wood available in the country.
Des facteurs de densité pour finalement avoir effectivement des facteurs d'émission propres aux différents types de formations végétales sur le territoire national. Et également pour le carbone
Now,
organique.
for organic carbon, also, the country had already developed an institution, the National Office for Soils, that had the inventory of the 12 regions of the country, which were useful to assess the emission factors relating to organic emission factors, with the support of the RED Plus initiative, we launched a survey to assess the various emission factors.
Effectivement, j'essaie d'être assez rapide parce que je peux voir le temps. Effectivement, au niveau de la RED+,
Now, regarding the RED Plus initiative, the results which we gained helped us support the work that is being done currently.
Les données sur les forêts.
Mainly the data on forest. This work carried out by the RED Plus gave us more specific emission factors, at least for the AFAT sector, at a national level. This is to show you how we went about collecting this data and coming to
parce
these
que notamment pour la
issue
biomasse
factors.
aérienne, on a appliqué les facteurs de densité.
For the air biomass, we applied the elements by default. Other elements were more specific to the country.
Étaient par défaut, mais les autres, effectivement, étaient des données vraiment
Other
pays.
data were country data.
Tout le travail a été réalisé au niveau national et même au niveau du pays, on est allé jusqu'aux différentes régions.
We surveyed the various regions of the country to come up to a list of emission factors that were more relevant.
C'est surtout la capacité, la disponibilité des données qui a été
Therefore, the main challenge for us was the availability of the data and access to data. These data existed, but we had to go and look for them. We had to have a lot of discussion and exchange. And because of the legal status of some organizations, so we had to discuss the various protocols, the various agreements to be able to have access to this data. Therefore, through our experience, we understood that it was important to develop a facility at a national level to be able to share data.
Le secteur AFAT, il y a beaucoup plus de
Regarding the AFAT sector, the things are a lot more complex. If we work in a sector like forestry, you have to also take into account what happens in the agricultural field or the cattle field, which required a level of synchronization. When we were trying to assess the forestry field, we also realized that when it came to emission factors, the category was actually more representative of agriculture than forestry. So in the forestry, we had to also include the agricultural
des émissions liées, par exemple, à l'utilisation des engrais chimiques.
For example, the use of fertilizer,
Il y a
chemical
effectivement une
fertilizers.
nécessité de vraiment
Therefore,
établir au
there
niveau
is a
national
need at a national level to have a relevant framework to look at the emission factors to avoid any wasted time. The second aspect is the financial aspect.
assez cher. Il faut
S'il vous plaît, coupez les micros pour les gens qui n'interviennent pas.
Please, can you mute your mic? Can you mute your mic? Thank you. It requires a range of stakeholders, a level of mobilization to reach the right expertise and to have access to the appropriate framework.
Je pense que, en résumé, voilà.
In a nutshell, this is what I wanted to share with you. Thank you. Thank you. It was very practical.
Un exemple très précis.
And
Et du coup, je
it's
vous
a
repose
very good example. So just one last question to all of our panelists. Despite the difficulties to create emission factors,
Est-ce que, en particulier, en plus sur
in
le secteur
particular in
donc,
Africa,
sur la foresterie, vous avez
especially in the effort
est-ce que des
sector,
coopérations régionales ou
are there
panafricaines
any regional or pan-African
pour travailler notamment
cooperation or initiatives to work on emission factors
par type de forêt ou
per category? Do you have any examples or any experience in that way? Anything that you could share about some regional cooperation? At the moment, or what has been done so far, we did it on a national level. There was no collaboration in the sub-region. However, there is a need to do so, and we do have a few initiatives between the north and the south. It's not yet completely formalized. There was such an initiative with a group of countries from the sub-region, for example, for a funding request to support these countries develop a common framework and experience sharing. I think it's something that will need to be developed in the future, but so far we've not had any collaboration, not as far as I know.
Je vais mettre mon micro, sinon ça sert à rien. Il y a probablement des messages de plaidoyer aussi à faire passer vis-à-vis.
I'm sure we would have some advocacy messages to send to the various institutional and regional stakeholders to get hold of this topic. I'm sure there are some synergies that can yet be developed and explored. Unfortunately, we've already gone beyond our time, so I'm going to have to draw to a conclusion now. We will share the results of the survey, Menti survey, which we asked at the beginning of this workshop. Now let's look at what's going to happen next. We are on a walk to share various initiatives around the issue of emission factors. So first of all, we will send you the minutes, the report on this workshop, and we will also send you a summary of the cycle of workshops that was done previously. And I would invite you to remain updated and informed about what we will be doing next.
De synergie entre les différents acteurs.
In order to facilitate as much synergy as possible, as much collaboration as possible.
Des idées très pertinentes, mais qui restent relativement isolées.
And there are some initiatives that are still isolated. And it would be good to share some more about this. Climate change will therefore continue its activities with climate data in Africa. Please feel free to post and send us your initiatives on our website, where you can share also your initiatives and your ideas.
Alors peut-être en dernier point aussi, par rapport à cette suite, sur ces ateliers, ce cycle
Now,
d'ateliers.
this is the results of the survey.
Sur un plaidoyer. Enfin, c'est vraiment
The purpose of these workshops is also to work on an advocacy and list the priorities for non-state actors and carry this message to cooperation stakeholders on behalf of non-state actors. You have here the results of the survey. What difficulties have you experienced during emissions factors? One person said there was no difficulty. That's good news for that person. Now, difficulties are either to do with difficulty of access to data, difficulty in accessing information and database on emission factors. Now, technical difficulties, secondly, and difficulties related to the sector you are dealing with.
Je vais prendre juste 2 minutes encore pour laisser éventuellement nos intervenants réagir.
I don't know if our speakers would like to react to the results of the survey, to this quick survey.
Mathieu, par exemple, est-ce que
Mathieu, would you like to comment on this result?
tu souhaites réagir?
Je crois que c'est surtout les experts techniques qui
I
pourront
think it's mainly the technical aspect, or maybe the technical expert could comment this result more than I, but it shows that there is a need, however, to reinforce capacities to overcome technical difficulties, in particular in some sectors. The way Georges Coetet mentioned the AFET sector, this was very practical and very inspiring, and it showed how organisms like the Red Plus can act as levers.
Des modalités, je dirais, de collecte d'informations pour établir les
For
facteurs.
collecting information. I'm not a technical expert, as I said, so I'd rather not say more. Maybe I can hand over to the real expert.
Alors peut-être je vais laisser la parole à Joriatou et puis on conclura là-dessus. Comme ça, on a un équilibre de genre.
Mrs. Wage, would you like to conclude? It was very interesting indeed to look at the various aspects, the practical aspect, the governing aspects, and my word of conclusion will be to keep in mind the different levels of accounting and the various objectives that we can have for ongoing approach, even though we saw that the local authorities were swinging between the two types of priorities. Thank you very much. I'm sorry we were not able to take more questions, but we did take into account all of your questions and we will try to answer them by email. Thank you very much for participating. And again, thank you and see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Merci beaucoup. Au revoir.
Ok, merci beaucoup. Ok, merci.
Ok, merci beaucoup. Au revoir.
Au revoir. Ok, merci.